Okay, well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce John Lennox, who's originally from Northern Ireland and is a mathematician, a philosopher of science, and a Christian apologist. He's presently professor of math at Oxford and emeritus professor of math and philosophy of science at Green College, which you see in the background there at Oxford. And he's also a pastoral advisor at Green College. John is author of numerous books and articles, many of which are scholarly and scientific on his math specialty, which is group theory. But he's more widely known for his books on science and faith aimed at popular audiences. Recently, he wrote Artificial Intelligence 2084, a takeoff on 1984, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity, which is, of course, his topic today. Craig Gay, who will do the response immediately after John's lecture, is professor of interdisciplinary studies at Regent College in Vancouver, where he directs the Regent's Masters of Theology degree program. His doctorate is from Boston University, and his area of expertise is Christianity, society, and culture. Craig has authored several books on topics such as secularization and modern social theory, as well as on economics and technology. I've taken courses in, I think, 2019 with both Craig and John when I was working on my own master's in theology at Regent. And I learned very much from both of them about how to think Christianly about the challenges facing us in today's world. In 2019, maybe AI was not such a hot topic in the Christian community. So I'm looking forward to hearing John and Craig updating us on all of the happenings in AI. Thank you. And now we welcome John Lennox.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's not a very impressive start for someone who's written a book on AI and the future of technology, but it's lovely to be back with people from UBC, one of the university campuses that I remember best and love most, because there are very few universities in the world that can boast eagles flying across the skies. And it's a particular honor to be invited by Gordon and to meet you, Craig. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. I prepared a PowerPoint because I hope that will stimulate lots of questions. This is a huge topic, and we'll dive straight into it at the rather extreme end of it to start with a quotation from and now we're blocked. Oh dear. The slides now won't advance. There we are. This is Lord Rees, the UK Astronomer Royal, and he seems to be very much a techno-optimist. He says abstract thinking by biological brains has underpinned the emergence of all culture and science, but this activity, spanning tens of millennia at most, will be a brief precursor to the more powerful intellects of the inorganic post-human era. So in the far future, it won't be the minds of humans, but those of machines that will most fully understand the cosmos. Now, that statement is riddled by all kinds of assumptions, which we may want to investigate. But I'd like to contrast it with a little bit of techno-pessimism. This is Jaron Lanier, and he says the danger isn't that a new alien entity will speak through our technology and take over and destroy us. To me, the danger is that we'll use our technology to become mutually unintelligible or to become insane, if you like, in a way that we are acting with enough understanding and self-interest to survive, and we die through insanity. So those are the two extremes. And one of the things that motivated me to write was the famous dystopias of Huxley and Orwell. And my title, 2084, by the way, was suggested by a colleague in Oxford who's very well known, Professor Peter Atkins, who's an atheist. And we were on our way to a debate. And he said, we mustn't discuss the debate. What are you writing? And I said, well, I'm writing about AI. And he immediately said, I've got a title for you. And I said, what is it, Peter? He said, 2084. Well, I said, it's super. If I use it, I'll acknowledge you. And I did. And I did acknowledge him. One of the books that interested me years ago, and I returned to it, is Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he makes a very, I think, perceptive remark comparing these two people. He says that Orwell warns us that we will be overcome by externally imposed oppression. But in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. Now, that last phrase there really weighs with me. It raises a huge question. How much are we actually undoing our capacity to think? So Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. And I suspect that both are true simultaneously today. We have a love-hate relationship with our technology. And Postman's worth actually pursuing a little bit, because he also says that, stated in the most dramatic terms, the accusation can be made that the uncontrolled growth of technology destroys the vital sources of our humanity. It creates a culture without a moral foundation. It undermines certain mental processes and social relations that make human life worth living. Technology in some is both friend and enemy. This paragraph comes after a number of positive things he says. His book is called Technopoly, and it's interesting how it is defined as a self-justifying, self-perpetuating system wherein technology of every kind is cheerfully granted sovereignty over social institutions and national life. And if ever words were coming true, they are those words. Now, when I wrote my book on AI, I was interested in being fair as I could. And of course, not being a pioneer engineer in AI, I'm a pure mathematician, but I'm very interested in the implications, particularly philosophical, ethical, and theological, of technology in terms of the way in which human beings derive their meaning. But in order to be fair, I thought it was very important to start with certain very positive things. And so we distinguish between two kinds of AIs, as I suspect all of you are aware: narrow AI and general AI. So a narrow AI system does one thing, and usually only one thing, that normally requires an intelligent human. A very good example of this is in radiology. You have an AI that analyzes chest X-ray images. Let's say we take 1 million of them, and they form the big database. Then an image is taken of my lungs, and it's rapidly compared by an algorithm with those 1 million images, and it finds the image that's labeled with a disease in the database that is closest to the picture taken of my lungs. And these days, the kind of results that are given by this kind of visual imagery are better than you get in the average hospital. So that's a very positive thing. But it's very important, as we think of this, to realize that what we're in is simulating intelligence. And one needs to keep repeating this. An AI system is not intelligent, but it simulates intelligence. And I just want to say a little bit more about that, because it is the imitation game that goes back to the famous mathematician, Enigma machine solver, Alan Turing. The interesting thing to me, it struck me a long time ago, is in human beings, intelligence is coupled with consciousness. But we don't know what consciousness is. At least the leading researchers in the area admit this. And as a result, I think, many leading AI researchers are content to simulate intelligence without trying to create artificial consciousness, which is regarded as a very hard problem. Now, don't take my word for that. One of the most important books on AI, introducing it to students, is by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig. And they openly say, we are interested in creating programs that behave intelligently. The additional project of making them conscious is not one that we are equipped to take on, nor one whose success we would be able to determine, which seems to me to be very honest. Now, I came across a wonderful paper, one of the early papers in artificial intelligence by Professor Joseph McCrae Mellichamp of the University of Alabama, who was a pioneer in this field. He's still alive, and I met him quite by accident. And he wrote a paper years ago, which attracted quite a bit of attention, including from a Nobel Prize winner. And the title is this: The Artificial in Artificial Intelligence is Real. That is, the word artificial in the phrase artificial intelligence is real. And he wrote, it seems to me that a lot of needless debate could be avoided if AI researchers would admit that there are fundamental differences between machine intelligence and human intelligence. Differences that cannot be overcome by any amount of research. In other words, the artificial in artificial intelligence is real. And that's something we must bear in mind, because the vocabulary in this whole topic tends to be tendentious, because it personifies almost everything. Deep learning, even artificial intelligence itself, makes you think that somehow it is like human intelligence when it only simulates it. And we can go through a list of examples that we all are aware of, and many of which we use today, and we find them remarkably helpful. They've got an upside: digital assistants, online shopping, medicine, the development of the vaccine for coronavirus, and then we move on to autonomous vehicles and so on. But as you look at this list, you will discover that every one of these things, well, let me put it this way: AI is like a knife. Every technology is like a knife. A sharp knife can be used for surgery, or it can be used for murder. It depends on the use of it. And as you go down this list, you discover that many of these things, the very capacity they have to do the positive thing, is a capacity for evil. And that's where we got to be careful. For instance, in online shopping, many people, I find, don't realize that they're actually voluntarily giving away a lot of information about themselves, their habits, what they buy, where they shop, etc. And they're not aware that that is being sold to large corporations for a profit without their permission. And Susanna Zuboff of MIT has written a book called Surveillance Capitalism that goes into this in considerable detail, and she's taken very seriously indeed. Medicine, we've seen many positive things, autonomous vehicles, but let's think of job search and interview techniques. AI is often used to avoid the need for a person-to-person interface in an interview, but it's been discovered that many AI systems, the algorithms show bias against people of color, bias against men or women, bias against particular political affiliations, and so on. And here come the ethical problems. How do we get rid of this kind of bias? Think of crime prevention. Facial recognition technology is hugely advanced, being capable now of recognizing someone not simply by their face, but if their face isn't available, by their gait, from the rear view, and so on. And that's wonderful if you want to pick a criminal out from a crowd. But it's very well known that in certain parts of the world, this very same technology is being used to keep very close tabs on citizens, and it's being used to suppress minorities, as in the case of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China. And we could also talk about the social credit systems that are being rolled out in that particular part of the world, and may well increasingly be rolled out in the West. And here we all are voluntarily wearing a tracker, an iPhone or a smartphone, and I've got one sitting on my desk, so I'm no exception to this. And it can be used to get very close to almost everything we do. And we could talk about social control, autonomous weapons, and perhaps the latest in a long line of very problematic things is the matter of deep fakes and the chat GPT, and the whole fact that a simple audio clip of me speaking plus a video clip can be then doctored and modified to make me say almost everything, which is going to result in a huge avalanche of misinformation and disinformation. And people are really concerned about it in the future. So those are things that are already operating, and that's very important. This is not the sci-fi edge of it. This is not assuming that we're going to get to artificial general intelligence. It's what actually is happening at the moment, with many examples multiplying every day. So having talked about the narrow, let's think about AGI, artificial general intelligence. So the idea is to build a super intelligent AI system that equals or exceeds all human capacities. And there are two avenues of research. The first is to enhance existing humans by bioengineering, or by constructing a superintelligence from scratch on some kind of inorganic base in order to avoid the painful problems of aging and death. And as I look at these things and read around, the big question seems to me to be this: is all of this, even if it were realizable, even if it were fractionally realizable, is it going to enhance humans, or is it going to depersonalize humans? Now, one of the leading thinkers in this area is not a scientist. He's not a pioneer in AI. He's a historian, but he's written two best-selling books that have considerable influence: Sapiens and Homo Deus, the man who is gone, Yuval Noah Harari. Now, I interact with him in my book, not because I think his theses are true or even impressive, but because of his influence. It's worth being aware of his fundamental theses because they have been open to a great deal of criticism. They remind me of Steven Pinker. He says that war is obsolete. You're more likely to commit suicide than be killed in conflict. Secondly, famine is disappearing. You're more at risk from obesity than starvation. One wonders what part of the world he's talking about. And the third thing is that death, human physical death, is now just a technical problem, and as such, it will have a technical solution. Now, those are very questionable as theses, but he announces the agenda for the 21st century. Firstly, a serious bid for immortality, and secondly, an intensification of the pursuit of happiness, a very ancient pursuit. Now, here's how he thinks it's going to be done. It will be necessary to change our biochemistry and re-engineer our bodies and minds. So we shall need to re-engineer Homo sapiens so that it can enjoy everlasting pleasure. Having raised humanity above the beastly level survival struggles, we will now aim to upgrade humans into gods and turn Homo sapiens into Homo Deus. At least he spells gods with a small g. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And as a result of that, he says humankind is now poised to replace natural selection with intelligent design, an interesting choice of words, and extend life from the organic realm into the inorganic. Which brings me to transhumanism, which emanates a great deal of it, at least, from the University of Oxford, one college of which you see behind me, my own college, Green Templeton. Nick Bostrom, who directs the Oxford Institute for the Future, defines transhumanism to be the intellectual and cultural movement that affirms the possibility and the desirability of fundamentally improving the human condition through applied reason, especially by developing and making widely available technologies to eliminate aging and to greatly enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological abilities. Now, this is attracting vast sums of money. I find it a bit difficult to believe the kind of sums of money that I've heard that are attracted to these kind of programs. It's not millions, but it appears to be billions if the pundits are to be believed. And it seems to me that we're in risk of not heeding a warning that was given a very long time ago. Now, as you can see, I am very old, and I'm old enough to have listened to the late C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis wrote in the 1940s a book that I believe anybody interested in this field should read. And if they've read it once, they should read it again. It's called The Abolition of Man. And in it, he wrote this: what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as his instrument. Man's conquest of nature means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. There neither is nor can be a simple increase of power on man's side. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger. Every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he is also the prisoner who follows the triumphal car. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man. Now, Lewis realized that if you construct a being, either by using AI, by using bioengineering and all the rest of it, if that entity is constructed by a group of scientists, it will be an artifact. It will be, in that sense, a thing. And he points out the fact that this is a highly dehumanizing process. Now, in the United States, there is a cultural commentator and ethicist that I find always very interesting to read, and that is Professor Leon Kass. We have paid some high prices for the technological conquest of nature, he writes, but none as high as the intellectual and spiritual costs of seeing nature as mere material for our manipulation, exploitation, and transformation. With the powers of biological engineering gathering, there will be splendid new opportunities for similar degradation of our view of man. If we come to see ourselves as meat, then meet we shall become. And I would like to use that to raise the question of a lot of these attempts to produce artificial general intelligence are extremely reductionist, which is perhaps not surprising because it is mainly driven by atheists and their worldview and philosophy comes right through. Some of them, some of the people that are pioneering AI, not holding necessarily transhumanist views, are very honest about the fact that it is a degradation of humanity. For example, Yoshua Bendigo, who's very well known, people need to understand that current AI and the AI we can foresee in the reasonable future does not and will not have a moral sense or moral understanding of what is right and what is wrong. So it now comes to the question of we're building machines, technology, we're building them to simulate intelligence, but we're having huge difficulty in putting into them any kind of a moral compass. And it's obvious, of course, to all of us that the technology is outpacing the ethics at a colossal speed. And it's no wonder that people are concerned, and you will notice that among several of the leading players, they are desperate to get some sort of consensus, world consensus, about what kind of ethics to build in. The difficulty is that the ethics that are built in will be the ethics of the programmers. And that leads to all kinds of big problems that you may well want to discuss and help me with. AI and morality, no morality, but what about truth? A former head of GCHQ, it's our cybersecurity headquarters in the UK, recently said that the fabric of society could be undermined by AIs impersonating real people. That's back to deep fakes. So that it would no longer be possible to distinguish truth from falsehood. Deepfake technology will ensure that billions of people will be deceived. Now, we need to add to that what's called the control problem. It's very interesting to me that several of the leading players have attempted to impose a moratorium on research on GPT and like things. And it's a bit difficult to see why they're doing that. The technology is powering ahead, and yet the people who are developing the technology are the people that say, well, we'll save you from the consequences of it. And then they're letting slip that they don't really understand what it's doing. I recently asked someone very high up in this industry if they're not telling us everything. And he said to me, I think they're not. So I don't know, maybe some of you know what's going on. But I was very interested in what Paula Boddington said. If we see the Genesis account of the fall of man as foreshadowing fears about robots, then Genesis gets the problem exactly right for exactly the right reasons. It's a worry about autonomy itself. What might robots do if we can't control them fully? Will they adhere to the same value system as us? Will they decide to disobey us? What will our relationship with our creations be? We can thank the Hebrew account of Genesis for pre-warning us about this danger thousands of years ago. In other words, what people are saying, perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek, if God lost control of the creatures he created, we might well be in danger of running exactly the same risk. So does AI mean that the end of humanity is nigh? Well, Mark Andreessen, who's a pioneer web engine developer, thinks not. He says it's maths, it's code, computers built by people, owned by people, controlled by people. The idea that it will at some point develop a mind of its own and decide that it has motivations that lead it to try to kill us is a superstitious hand wave. In short, AI doesn't want, it doesn't have goals, it doesn't want to kill you, because it's not alive. It's a machine. It's not going to come alive any more than your toaster. Well, maybe so, but I think many people would think it's a great deal more dangerous than your toaster. And that's something that we can discuss. So what we notice from these kind of quotations is there seem to be clearly two sides to this. You've the late Stephen Hawking, the brilliant cosmologist in Cambridge, worrying about AI really not having its goals aligned, as he put it, with human values, and therefore destroying humans. And somebody has rather tongue-in-cheek said, well, maybe an AI will be benevolent enough to keep a few humans around as pets. Now, many people put up AGI scenarios, and this has interested me for a reason that will come apparent fairly rapidly. One of the most famous, I think, is Max Tegmark in his AGI scenarios in his book called Life 3.0. We needn't go into the details, but he has various scenarios, a libertarian utopia where the humans exist in peace with the superintelligences. Then, and he uses the word protector God, so that there's an essentially omniscient and omnipotent AI that maximizes human happiness and so on. And that all sounds really very positive. But then there's the enslaved God one, where somehow a superintelligent AI is confined by humans who use it to produce vast technology and incredible wealth that can be used for good or bad, depending on the human controllers. And then there's the conqueror situation, where AI takes control and decides that humans are a threat, a nuisance, or a waste, and gets rid of us by a method that we don't understand. So Tegmark goes through these. Now remember, he's a physicist at Princeton with an international reputation. What fascinated me about Tegmark was in his book, he starts with what looks like his favored scenario, which he calls the Omega Project, which is an artificial intelligence that takes over the entire planet, its businesses and everything else. And this power he calls Prometheus. And the result is that for the first time ever, our planet was run by a single power called Prometheus, amplified by an intelligence so vast that it could potentially enable life to flourish for billions of years throughout the cosmos. But what specifically was their plan? And he goes on to say that with the excuse of fighting crime and terrorism and rescuing people suffering medical emergencies, everybody could be required. Now, pay close attention to this. This is the idea of a brilliant physicist thinking about the future. Everybody could be required to wear a security bracelet that combined the functionality of an Apple Watch with continual uploading of position, health status, and conversations overheard. Unauthorized attempts to remove or disable it would cause it to inject a lethal toxin into the forearm. And reflecting on all of this, he says, are we really in an unavoidable battle with an AI monster to stay alive? Listen to much of the debate and you could be forgiven for thinking so. So here he sets up a whole list of scenarios for AGI. He singles one out to give particular attention to. I don't know how committed he is to it or not. I suspect it's as much speculation as anything else. But then he raises the question of AGI being a monster that we have to combat. Now, if you put all those two things together, and this is one of the reasons I wrote my book, it reminded me of something written 20 centuries before Tegmark wrote his book, the Book of Revelation, which, as you will all know, is one book in the Bible that actually talks about the future. And here the imagery is a beast, a wild thing, is probably the best translation of it. A monster rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, 10 diadems on its horn, all the rest of it. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. This is universal control. They worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who's like the beast and who can fight against it? So this is very much like Prometheus. If you go on a bit, you find a second wild monster in the book of Revelation, another beast rising out of the earth, and it describes it. And what it does is to deceive those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. Now, we can't go into the details of this, but the fascinating thing is what happens next. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all to be marked on the right hand, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark that is the name of the beast, of the number of its name. This is identical, essentially, in terms of what it does to Tegmark's bracelet that will inject a lethal toxin into people that don't follow the commands. Now, of course, it will be argued that these are metaphors and symbols in the book of Revelation, and so they are. But I learned a lot about English grammar, indeed, a lot about other languages grammar from C.S. Lewis, and he never tired of pointing out that metaphors and symbols represent realities. And the interesting thing is that the book of Revelation actually explains what the metaphor is standing for in a famous statement, which is massively misunderstood. And it's this: this calls for wisdom. Let the one who's understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, you probably know that that number has been solved millions of times, probably, with all kinds of people suggested, from the early Caesars to Genghis Khan to Hitler to all kinds of folks. Attempts to solve what is a gematria have been far too successful. But what has been not noticed is what it is. It is the number of a human being. That, I find, is the most sinister and scary thing about it. Who 666 is, I haven't a notion. You may have, but I don't. But that it is the number of man is telling you a most interesting thing. It's telling you that this wild thing that governs the earth is going to be a human being. Now, we're getting very near to Tegmark. And my argument these days is, look, if you're going to take a scenario like that of Tegmark seriously, then why not have a look at the biblical scenario for the future and see if it makes sense in light of these scenarios that people take very seriously indeed? And I want to suggest that it makes a great deal of sense. And we notice, by the way, in that the book of Revelation talks about universal worship, but a new AI religion is being suggested. And this is a statement from a professor in Canada. He says, we are about to witness the birth of a new kind of religion. In the next few years, or perhaps even months, we will see the emergence of sects devoted to the worship of artificial intelligence. For, says Neil MacArthur, who is an ethicist in Montreal, for certain AI systems are beginning to exhibit the kind of capacities usually ascribed to deity, such as immortality, omniscience, and omnipresence. These super AIs have prayer-like connectivity via the internet, the oracle-like capacity of ChatGPT to give a plausible answer to virtually any question, produce life advice, even scriptures, almost instantaneously. nor have they needs or desires like humans, only electricity. And various AI systems have been spawned. Now compare that with a plain, straightforward, non-symbolic statement in the New Testament by the Apostle Paul that parallels in many details what is said in Revelation. I haven't time to argue it, but you will all be aware of this, I suspect. The Homo Deus, the man who is God from the earth. And Paul says, for that day, that is the day of judgment, will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming to be God. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the power of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders and deceptions. Now that parallels Revelation, and what is very interesting in it is at its heart is a homo deus of the Harari type, a human being claiming divine honors. Now, Paul taught this to a group of Christians when he'd only been in their town for 3 weeks, and they'd come from raw paganism, and yet he told them about the future. That raises an obvious question. Why did he do that? And he explains that he was telling them what was going to happen in the future because the seeds of it were already in their society in Rome at the time. He says the mystery of lawlessness is already operating. In other words, the Caesars were already showing they wanted themselves worshipped and they took divine honors. This, by the way, is spiritual lawlessness. The Roman law was pretty tough. This is the lawlessness that's explained here, exalting yourself against God. It's the claim to be God that is as old as history itself. It's the first temptation. And so Paul says, look, in the future, this is going to reap a huge harvest. And now, the fascinating thing to me is we're seeing it done not in the name of backstreet religions, but in the name of the most advanced technology to turn human beings into gods. It's again the search for godhood. This all raises acutely the question, what is a human being? And what is the value of a human being? And if we're going to look at this kind of question, we do need a worldview perspective. And there's my teacher of quantum mechanics from 60 years ago, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne. And he wrote, if we are to understand the nature of reality, we've only two possible starting points, either the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. So we come to worldview questions. And E.O. Wilson, a world famous biologist, wrote this: the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and it's terrifically dangerous. Until we answer those huge questions of philosophy that the philosophers abandoned a couple of generations ago, where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? Rationally, we're on very thin ground. Now, I think he's a bit rough on philosophers. I know quite a few eminent philosophers who are asking these questions, even though people like Richard Dawkins tell us that we're not allowed to ask them. So the two major worldviews in tension, really, in the academy in particular, are the worldviews of atheism and theism. And just coming now towards a conclusion, let's think about the atheist worldview. Sean Carroll and John Gray, both very eminent intellectuals. We humans are blobs of organized mud, which through the impersonal workings of nature's patterns have developed the capacity to contemplate and cherish and engage with the intimidating complexity of the world around us. The meaning we find in life is not transcended. Amazing how dogmatic it is. And John Gray, commenting on some of this hype of artificial general intelligence, he says, humans may well use science to turn themselves into something like gods as they have imagined them to be. But no supreme being will appear in the scene. Instead, there will be many different gods, each of them a parody of human beings that once existed. That's a fascinating statement, but just contrast that with the biblical worldview. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God made humans in his own image. In the beginning was the Word. This is a word-based universe. And the central claim of Christianity is that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. No supernatural being will appear, said John Gray, the professor of intellectual history in London. But Jesus said, you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of God and coming on the clouds of heaven. The scenarios are vastly different. And I like to sum this up, that the difference between transhumanism and Christianity is very easy to see. In transhumanism, humans are to be turned into gods. In Christianity, the direction of motion is the exact opposite. It is that God becomes human. And I think encapsulated in that is how at least I want to approach this and the dangers I see in the transhumanist agenda. And what about then, as we conclude, the future for redeemed humanity? Well, actually, this idea of uploading our brains onto silicon and giving them a permanent representation has got a grain of truth. I think it's a stolen idea. You see, let me put it this way in conclusion. I find it almost amusing. Some people tell me about this agenda, transhumanism, and we'll be able to do this and that and upload our brains, solve the problem of physical death. And I say, you're too late. And they're rather bewildered. And they said, what do you mean you're too late? Well, I said, first of all, the problem of physical death was solved 20 centuries ago when God raised Jesus from the dead. And as to the uploading that you're hoping for, I can tell you something infinitely better than that, because there's a lot of evidence that God did rise Jesus from the dead, both historical and subjective in terms of experience, but he promised that those who trust him and accept him as the true Homo Deus will receive life that cannot die, and one day he will speak and will raise them from the dead. There's no uploading promised by any transhumanist anywhere in that ballpark. Just think of these wonderful words. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable. We shall be changed. This mortal body must put on immortality. And coming up in a few weeks to the age of 80, ladies and gentlemen, that promise to me trumps vastly anything that is contained in what I think are the risky promises of transhumanism, because you will have noticed that the one thing all attempts at utopia avoid is the problem of human evil and sin. You won't find it there. And that's why all attempts at creating utopia have tended to end in a bloodbath. Only in Christianity do I see a real solution to the problem of human sin and the problem of pain and evil. And Jesus here is not in competition with anybody else, because he is the only one that offers us what he offers us in terms of salvation from guilt and also eternal life and a new power to live, and offers us something that's undreamed of in transhumanist circles. Well, thank you for listening. And I'm sure you'll have lots of things to say. God bless you all.
Thanks so much, John. And so now we'll have a response from Dr. Craig Gay from Regent College.
Well, thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. And let me just pause here and ask, can you all hear me? Or is
Yes.
the technology?
Yes,
Okay,
we can hear you.
I think this contrast of the promises that we are so often hearing of the promises of AI and technology and so forth, to contrast those with the assured hope of the good news of Christ is just exactly what we need to be hearing more of the time. I don't. I mean, I applaud that. That was a wonderful aspect of your remarks. Let me just begin with my comments just by saying I'm no expert on AI at all. I mean, it's not something I've thought probably much more about than any of the rest of you. The only thing I can think of saying in addition to what John has already said is, I think, and he mentioned this question of why is there so much investment being poured into this at the moment, and it's billions of dollars, and it's not just private equity; it's government money as well. And I think, it's obviously simply because people believe AI is going to make them money, at least on the private side. Money along the lines of that, John mentioned surveillance capitalism and so forth, and that's where the money is. And obviously, they feel that this new technology will empower that. Governments, in parallel, believe that AI will enable them to prevail against their enemies, both externally and internally. So, this is already being employed to, for the purposes of social control. And surely the AI race will be, it's already being employed in warfare. But all of that, points directly to the comments that Lewis makes in The Abolition of Man, that this is all about the control of the many by the few. And it will mean the loss of freedom for most of us, as we are, I think, increasingly, as our behavior is increasingly basically controlled by others probably these are agencies that we probably won't really know much about. I think it will be justified in the name of things like safety, comfort, convenience, affluence. Again, basically, the ease of life in this world. And that's what I've always understood, or not always, but I've come to feel that this symbolic significance of the number 666 in the book of Revelation, it simply means secularity. It's the number of incompleteness. It's the number of this world, of this life, of this age. And I think we're already seeing this, that the rapid exodus from the churches in contemporary society, and most of the reasons given are that the church is no longer seen to be useful for concerns that I have about my life in the here and now. You know, my job, my work, my leisure activities, and so forth. It's people no longer see the point in going to a church that isn't focused on all of these temporal things. So yeah, anyway, I'll leave it at that. But no, I think if we're lucky, and I use the word lucky casually here, this general artificial intelligence, which is currently what they call a large language model intelligence, may well collapse simply because of the garbage in, garbage out problem. And that's, you know, some are predicting that this could happen actually quite quickly, because it's relying on all of the, basically all of the stuff that's out there on the internet. And of course, we know that already that the internet is just full of garbage. I mean, there is useful stuff out there, but there's a whole lot of just trash. So to the extent that these systems rely on that, and to the extent that they contribute to generating more of it on the basis of what is already there, one of the predictions is that the thing will collapse really quite rapidly, and that may be good. That would be a kind of replication of the Babel story in Genesis, and you know, who knows? I mean, who knows how long God wants to let this go before he, you know, calls an end to it. But yeah, so that's all I can think of saying. Thank you very much for bearing with me on this. But thank you, John. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Craig. And this time we'll take questions. So if you want to ask a question, just unmute your microphone. You could also, you know, put something in the chat if you just want to write a question down. But this would be a good time to ask John or Craig any of your questions.
Gordon Felix Jurity, I wonder if I could direct this sort of question to John, if I may. And that is the question of hope, in the sense that, is there anything, as you look back on it in human history, that leads us to be optimistic? Where have we stood back? I guess the nuclear bomb perhaps is an example. Where have we in history as mankind walked away from technologies that are questionable in terms of no controls, and in fact we as a species have exercised that common restraint? And I'm mindful of asking that question because of what we are watching, for instance, in climate change, an example of what is going on the road with wars, etc., etc. So the people who have this incredible ability to develop these technologies seem incapable, we humans, of exercising control. Is there any aspect out there that leads you to be optimistic?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And Craig, thank you very much for your remarks too, which I do appreciate. And I agree that we're going to have to face this more and more. I think the trends that are mentioned throughout Scripture will intensify. Christ himself told us to expect them to intensify. And I'm afraid technology is going to be one of them, as many people and many writers, even totally secular writers, see. Now, the question of optimism, I prefer, in a way, to use your word, your earlier word, and that is hope. Where is there hope? Because it is pretty clear that the amount of hope or optimism you have is very much dependent on worldview as well as your own experience of life. Well, what I mean is it's very different for those of us who are sitting in Canada or Oxford in our homes. We look at it differently experientially from people who have no homes and are sitting in sub-Saharan Africa, desperate for the next meal. And it's very risky for us to pontificate. But it seems to me that you're asking a difficult question for the simple reason it's generic. Hope for whom and in what kind of circumstances? And I think that people in our kind of circumstance, in the West and in the academy in particular, deep questions need to be raised about the hopelessness of their atheism. Often they tell me that their hope is in their children and in their grandchildren because they have no ultimate hope. And I would go as far as to say atheism by definition is hopeless. There is no ultimate hope. But Christianity faces the hard problem, and the hard problem for all of us is the problem of evil. It faces it not by pretending it doesn't exist, but by showing us a God who suffered in a unique way to give hope through the death and resurrection of Christ. And if it weren't for that resurrection and the promise that Christ gives to those who trust him, I would have no hope whatsoever, except in the very limited sense of enjoying, if I'm in a position to enjoy, the things around me, nature, family, and so on. But there's nothing ultimate because death finishes all in the atheist worldview. So issuing a notice of general optimism seems to me to be totally impossible. There's no fix-it-all solution, politically or any other way. We've got to face the moral problems, the problem of human sin, rebellion against God. We cannot avoid, if you like, theology. And that's the problem, to inject a God dimension into a reductionist, materialistic worldview that thinks that they can retain meaning and reject God. I will never forget, I've spent quite a bit of time in Russia. I never forget an academician, the very top of the academic tree, saying to me, John, you know, we thought that we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. And we found out too late that we couldn't. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn very famously said that if you asked him what was responsible for the bloodbath that killed hundreds of millions of his fellow citizens, he said very simply, we have forgotten God. And I labor, and I'm really concerned as I get older, how can I find ways of making God credible in a society that feels that all solutions must be attained and achieved without any reference to the transcendent? That doesn't answer your question, but it shows at least where the problem lies.
Thank you very much for your response.
Thank you. John, I have one question. Someone asked me about the mix between AI and quantum computing, and they were saying that this stands to be a great leap forward in some way. Have you thought about that issue at all?
I don't know enough about it to have thoughts about it. Several of my friends are engaged in quantum computing here in Oxford, and it's still in its infancy. It holds great promise just by the simple fact that if they achieve it at the level they hope to, it'll be very much faster than the computers we have at the moment, which seems pretty incredible because they're pretty fast now. And The computers we have now have produced ChatGPT. So what a quantum computing AI system would produce is anybody's guess. I just don't know.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes. Do I
Yes,
need
Martin.
to?
Martin, yes.
Yeah. Hi, John. I'm Martin Est. I'm a computer scientist working in machine learning.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm at Fraser University in Vancouver. And I would like to ask a few questions regarding consciousness.
Yes.
Right? How do you define? You mentioned it's very hard to define, right? And people, but how would you define consciousness? How would you determine whether a system has achieved consciousness? And do you believe? Why do you believe, or why do you not believe that computer systems or AI systems will ever achieve consciousness?
Well, it's always difficult to prove a negative, as you know, from your
I
own
understand.
field. And also, it interests me greatly that people like David Chalmers, who spent a lifetime studying consciousness, have moved to a kind of dualism, which is very interesting because many people are very allergic to the notion of substance dualism. That is, there are two kinds of stuff, putting it crudely. But it seems to me that defining it is essentially impossible. But there are other things in life that we don't know exactly what they are, but we know how to use them. And we know, in a sense, what they mean in practice. Let me give you an example of that. Energy. No physicist really knows what energy is, and yet we can use it, we can manipulate it, and all the rest of it. So there is a sense in which we roughly understand, when we use the word consciousness, that we're talking about an awareness within ourselves of something that we can describe as I, which appears to be different from our bodily embodiment. And it seems to me that that is an important thing, because the brain story and the mind story, and that's where it gets very interesting to my way of thinking, is I can tell you what's in my mind. I can't tell you what's in my brain. If you've got a computer tomography system, you can wire me up electronically and you can tell me quite a bit about what's in my brain. You can't tell what's in my mind. And it seems to me that the kind of experiments that neuroscientists have done indicate that it does make sense to believe that the mind story and the brain story are separate, although they're correlated. And I'm very skeptical about notions like, well, the mind emerges from the brain. The word emergence is used for to cover a multitude of sins. Does it emerge naturally, or with a catalyst, or with the input of information and all the rest of it? So it seems to me that when I'm asked that kind of question, I've actually written about it in a compendium of articles by people like myself, responding to this kind of question, which of course we can't answer, no one can, is that yes, there is a sense of awareness. Now, it interests me that people like Peter Norvig and so on, and you might want to add to this, they don't know what consciousness is. They're not even trying to make a conscious machine, because it's very difficult to make a machine that's conscious if you don't know what consciousness is. And I tend to think that AI is no more conscious than my toaster. Now, of course, you can begin to say, well, consciousness appears to extend to animals. Where does it stop? And that isn't so easy to say. Certain plants are sensitive to inputs and so on. And we can certainly simulate consciousness, as we're doing with AI. We're trying to create machines that do what normally requires a conscious intelligence. But I'm very skeptical about any claim that any given machine is in any sense sentient or conscious. You know, because I'm a mathematician, that's part of it. Because I do think that the human mind is capable of things that computers are not. I tend to find inspiration from Roger Penrose. I'm sure you're aware of his work on the fact that the human mind can think of something like Gödel's theorem. But since all machine activity is algorithmic, he reckons this is not algorithmic, so it will never be doable by a machine. So that is not an argument to answer your question, but at least it's an indicator that there are certain non-algorithmic things in human thinking that machines will never be able to do, even in principle. Because as you know, any computer can be simulated if you accept the Turing thesis, the church Turing thesis, by a Turing machine. So that would be my elementary approach to this.
We have another hand, but Calvin, just before you ask your question, I wonder if Martin has anything else to say or interact with Dr. Lennox on. Martin Nestor, do you have anything else to say?
John, thank you very much. I think obviously a big question we could discuss this. However, this was a helpful answer. And let me perhaps point out, I mean, I as a computer scientist, I strongly believe that AI systems work at the level of syntax, not at the level of semantic.
Yes.
So they manipulate the syntax very efficiently.
Agreed.
And but they do not really have the semantic. Basically, they don't know what they are talking about. They don't know the meaning of these words that they are manipulating, partly because they don't have a way to experience these words.
Exactly.
Right?
That's a very helpful addition.
I think this is very important, really, to distinguish these levels of syntax and semantics. And I completely agree that AI systems just simulate intelligence, right? I mean, I'm a big fan of the Chinese room experiment.
Yes, so am I.
Right?
So
I think that's really a very helpful. And I mean, in my discussions, I think that has been food for thought for many people with whom I've discussed these kinds of questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Martin. Now, Calvin, did you have a question? We've been waiting for a bit.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much, John, for your talk on this subject. I find it very interesting. And maybe just as a question, but also which might be a line of hope for us believers is, what do you think about this positioning? Because last year when we had the whole everyone freaking out about Lambda and Google, that was Google's Lambda being sentient and also having the capabilities to basically those a whole going back and forth within the scientific community. I was giving this some thought because so I brought this subject onto a podcast platform that I'm a part of. And so my question is, what do you think about this positioning? And this probably ties into the question that Martin had, which is, how do you define consciousness? By definition, sentient means faculty of perception. And if we talk about consciousness, it also talks about knowledge and knowing. And the question I'm asking is, I would look at it as consciousness as being, I think we need to start separating mind consciousness from, and also introduce spiritual consciousness. Now, I believe there's two kinds of consciousness, mind consciousness and spiritual consciousness. Now, I believe artificial intelligence, first of all, will never have spiritual consciousness. Now, if we go to mind consciousness by perception, the data points that I believe human beings, the way we build mind consciousness is through 5 inputs that we have for data. You know, the 5 senses that we have, you know, taste, hear, smell, touch, and sight. So if we look at how far technology has come, and there's lots of examples that we can look at. One of the things that I found interesting, some case studies I was doing.
Sorry, Calvin, you'll have to just wrap up your question. I think that John Lennox has to go fairly soon.
Yeah, so what I'm asking is, what do you think about starting not to define this as just under one umbrella, consciousness, and saying we have mind consciousness, but we also have spiritual consciousness? And computers can.
Okay.
I think you may, the better word perhaps in your context is awareness. Awareness of the spiritual dimension and awareness of ourselves and the mind that isn't necessarily spiritual, but both of them are connected with consciousness. But I'm going to have to apologize to everybody. I've got a pack to go to Prague in the morning, and I really need to go. And unfortunately, it's my fault that you were late. So thank you so much for listening, but please forgive me if I disappear.
Okay. Thanks very much, John. I really appreciate all your input. You gave us a lot to think about. All the best in your journey. I just have some wrap-up items here. So I do highly recommend the book by John Lennox. You must read this book, 2084. Very stimulating for the size of the book. I'll read you one quote from page 186, which kind of helps us to cap our discussion. The central claim of Christianity is that the future is far greater than anything AI or AGI can promise, since something infinitely bigger than either of them has already happened on our planet. God, who is responsible for the existence of the universe and its laws and the architecture of the human mind, the divine Logos, who was in the beginning, has coded himself into humanity. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So thanks very much, everybody, for all of your questions and participation. I just want to announce the next lecture in this series, and that's with Dr. Andrew Paul Davison from Cambridge University, Professor of Theology and Natural Science. And his talk will be on November 23rd at 4 p.m. on campus in Woodward Room 3. That's the IRC building, Medical Science Building. And his topic is theological implications of the natural origins of life. So again, getting down to some of the really fundamental questions about life, consciousness as today. And we really value you returning and carrying on this discussion with us. So again, from the Graduate Faculty Christian Forum, thank you everybody for your participation and your questions. And another time, we'll try to get the technology working a little bit earlier. All the best.